Hey everyone, welcome back. This is lesson 12. We are looking at nature versus nurture, the battle of the ages. Now, it is actually a dot point in our syllabus, and so we're going to learn about it. So, nature versus nurture is a debate, and it's about the extent to which aspects of our behaviour are either a product of inherited things that are passed down through things such as genetic factors, the idea that men and women are born certain ways, or if they're acquired influences, or if these behaviours that we have are learned. So it's examining the extent to which we are, I guess, predetermined, or exactly who we are is who we are, and we don't have a say in it, we just think we do, or that we're born and then everything we learn, or everything that we do is an experience of a learned behaviour, that nothing we have is typically by design or genetically. And we're going to, I guess, compare both sides of the debate, but we're also going to look at a third angle called epigenetics, which is exciting. But we're looking at the extent to which these influences us. I mean, the most rational person would say there are certainly elements of our being which are nature, which are out of our control, which are genetic, but there are also other points which are nurture driven, are learned behaviours and things like that. So we're going to look at, I guess, both sides of the argument there. We are then going to watch some cool videos about nature and nurture and some scientists' beliefs on the influence of either, and then we'll have a few scenarios. Alright, so we'll start with nature. So nature refers to our pre-wiring. It's our biology, it's our DNA and all the other genetic qualities inherited from our parents. So things like our eye colour, hair colour, skin colour, and other factors. So things like how tall you are, how short you are, even things like hereditary diseases or disorders. So if, like, my surgery I had on my leg, which I'm sure you've all heard about, that was a hereditary thing. Varicose veins, that my parents had. Ingrown toenails is another one, which a lot of people have commonly. But there are genetic factors there which predispose us to certain things. So that's what that is. So that's one facet of it. It also refers to the human instinct. Have you guys ever heard of the flight or fight response? The idea that when faced with a danger or something really frightening or scary or confronting, we either flight, we run away from it, or we fight, we tackle it head on. And it's very much an instinct. It's a response to a gut feeling that one may have. But similarly, our identity can be shaped by distinctive factors of who we are. So things such as biological, that should say features. So we have another word we need to add here, such as biological features. So this is an aspect of our genetic makeup that determines much of our identity. Guys, I've made an error live on camera. This should be gender. This should be gender. Our gender is shaped by distinct features of who we are, such as biological features, i.e., this is an aspect of our genetic makeup which determines much of our identity. So this idea that males are seen as the hunter, protector and provider across many cultures throughout time is this idea that males have naturally occurring genetics which make men, and this is just scientific, on average, and every stat, a lot of stats, not every stat, a lot of stats can prove this, as more dominant and aggressive. Typically the way our body is constructed, we typically have higher contents of muscle mass, and so almost the features that you're biologically born with shape the social constructions of the roles and status that you should have within society, is sort of the main argument or line of argument here with nature. And this idea that we're more dominant and aggressive, like for me, and sorry for any young males, our car insurance prior to the age of 25 costs more money than female car insurance. But that's because of all the stats that show men, like most of the men on the roads, the ones that are yahooing around, speeding in their Commodores, trying to compensate for something. So there's sort of stats reflecting in the overall nature of men and women too. And that's reflected, like I said, in the plethora of quantitative data that we have. So I guess that's sort of in a very brief sort of overview of the nature side of things. It's very much what someone or an individual is predisposed to, and it's very biologically driven. And it's these biological differences and changes which affect our social constructs and norms and behaviour. So this idea that our behaviour, although is very qualitative, is driven by these internal instincts, our emotions and all of that, which is largely, according to nature, regulated by how we were born, what our parents' DNA says, what their parents' DNA says, etc. That's sort of the nature influence. What nurture is then, is it refers to the influence of external factors, so things that are outside of what you're born. So, for example, the way our parents raise us, life experiences, and that behaviour in general is learnt through imitation. So it's not necessarily conditioning, sorry, that should say conditioning, but it's learnt through imitating as well, but the word here is conditioning. The idea that when we are growing up, the sort of social behaviours that we adopt are basically because of what our parents have shown us and taught us and conditioned us to be, and that when we imitate that, we're reflecting that nurture element. So the idea that if you were raised in a family that is really into a certain sport, the chances are that you might probably be very into that certain sport too, because that's a behaviour you've learned from conditioning through your parents. Not always the case, but it just means the idea that if you are, the science of the nurture argument believes that that is because it's been shaped and molded and taught to you. So other examples though include how much parents read with their children and how well children learn to read are related. And this shows us the impact that instilling values and beliefs at a young age can have. Like the stats that show that if parents read to their children, they do better in school. And then that affects children's, obviously, life outcomes later on. So that's that idea of a learned behaviour. Just one example, there are heaps of others, but that idea that there is a learned behaviour that is conditioning a child to be raised in a certain way will act and change what their personality and socialisation processes look like. And if we look back to this as an example, if we embed the concept of gender in, like we did with nurture, our environment can be shaped by our behaviour, which influences gender. So our environment can be shaped by our behaviour, which influences gender. So from the nurture perspective with gender, whereas nature was you're born a man, so therefore you have to be aggressive and dominant, the nurture perspective looks at it's very much created by the environment you're in. So if we use the role of hunters and warriors like we did here, or the idea that men were hunters and protectors and gatherers, that's not universally dominated. If that were true, we would see that across the whole world. There's a lot of instances where females operated in this role and were more dominant and aggressive in various cultures around the world. Like there are a lot of cultures, say, I think in parts of Kenya, where it's very matriarchal, where women are the hunters and gatherers, they're the ones that fend for themselves. I think there was a certain part in Greece where women were more dominant and sort of almost lived in isolation from men for the most part. So you can see that that's not universally dominated, so therefore this would suggest that gender roles are culturally determined as opposed to being biologically determined, according to the nature argument. So to summarise, nature is very much about your pre-wiring. Everyone's sort of, their behaviour, their social expectations is all inherent, you're born with it, and that's based off, a lot of the research seems to base it off ideas of gender, whereas the nurture sort of elements of it is very much about learned behaviours, learned conditioning by your parents, as well as other factors too. So like school conditioning someone a certain way, or religion conditioning someone a certain way comes into play a bit here as well. Like, you know, it's more lovey-dovey, which is why I've got the cute elephant family there. Nice photo of that. So what we're going to do now we've got a base understanding of the idea between the nature and nurture argument, there's a couple of videos, I guess, which are more scientific in nature, which unpacks each, right? So one of these is an argument that nurture is more important. Both of these experiments were conducted with, these guys were monkeys, and I think these one used chimpanzees and young children. I just want to disclaimer that Harlow's monkey experiment, it's a very famous experiment. We would not consider this ethical research today. Don't worry, I'm not getting you to watch like anything decrepit or anything like that. But it's a very famous experiment where this guy trained a monkey to accept milk from. Anyway, I'll let you watch it. Actually, it's probably better that the scientist explains it and not me. But at the end of the day, his findings were that he believed nurture plays a more significant role in development phases of young monkeys, but then he attributed that to young humans as well. The other one then in this video is looking at nature. So this one, I guess this argument supports more this idea that gender is more biologically based as opposed to socially constructed through nurture, and the idea that our roles and behaviours are very much inherent when we're born. So in this experiment, they look at children's toys and they get young kids and young chimpanzees to choose between like a pink toy and a blue toy, and they're relatively young kids. Obviously, you can judge the merits of the experiment yourself, but watching that video there would be good. Once you've watched them both, I then want you to answer this question. Which experiment do you think is more convincing? Nature or nurture? Why? Or do you sit somewhere in between? This one's convincing because of this one's convincing because of that. Let me know your thoughts once you've watched a few videos. The second thing I want you to do is list the following things into either a nature or nurture table, and then I want you to justify your choices. So for example, do you think intelligence is something you are born with, or is something that is more nurture based, is something that is developed and conditioned and fostered? Do you think sexuality is a nature or nurture influence? Do you think personality is nature or nurture? Do you think talent, or the idea that you are inherently born with talent, do you think that's nature, or do you think it's something you've got to work hard to get? There's no, with this table, this is just your personal opinion. Like I'm not here looking for right or wrong answers. I just want you to think whether you think nature or nurture is more dominant. It doesn't necessarily have to be 100% in one camp or 100% in the other camp. It's what you think it leans more towards. So if you think beliefs, like if we look at beliefs, there are elements which are inherently based as a human being species, and then like the need for safety and shelter and love, everyone has that need. But then there's beliefs that are definitely nurtured, like do people believe in capitalism, or do they believe in a certain side of politics and whatnot? I want you to choose which one you think it's more in the camp of, yeah? And then justify that there. After this, I want you to consider a scenario. So consider the nature versus nurture debate. And here it is. A baby is crying in the middle of the night. The child has been fed, but as one of the parents gets up to see the child, the partner says, "Don't spoil him, just let him cry to sleep himself." With this scenario in mind, I want you to think about what we've looked at versus nature and nurture. Do you think a baby can be spoilt through nurture, or should nature and the idea that babies will self-soothe themselves kick in? If you want to look at research for it, go ahead. But I guess your gut feeling of whether, because a lot of the argument between nature and nurture is around the time when a child is born, that they inherently have these qualities, or it's taught. And I want you to sort of think about this scenario and again pitch your ideas or debate here. This doesn't mean, again, I'm not looking for a right or wrong answer. I just want you to explore the debate, because this whole lesson is about a debate, as you can see with the previous activities. Once you have done all that, the last question I want you to do on the topic of nature versus nurture is the following. To what extent is nature or nurture the most influential force in the socialization process? So I'm asking you here to take a stance on the extent to which you think nature or nurture is more influential. Now, that is not to say that you don't think nature is influential if you choose nurture, or if you choose nurture, that nature is not influential. What I'm asking for here is to what extent do you think one or the other is most influential? Like your ratio might be 60-40, or it might be 90-10, or it might be 100-0. Whatever it is, I want you to try and articulate that argument here for me in the lines provided. Now again, this isn't like a former proper essay or anything like that. I'm very much more interested in hearing your thoughts on the matter and to see how you grapple with the debate, as is the dot point. Once you have done that, I want you to consider over this page. There's no, I guess, word bank or anything to fill out, but I want you to read this and highlight and tell me your thoughts on it, because there's this concept called epigenetics. It's a newish form of research and scientists, and it almost seems to combine the best of both worlds with nature and nurture. It's quite interesting. So it's changing the nature versus nurture debate. In recent years, there's been a growing realization that the question of how much behavior is due to hereditary, so passed down through nature, so that's basically nature if you want to annotate that, and how much to the environment, if you want to write underneath that nurture, may itself actually be the wrong question. So this idea that nature versus nurture is the wrong question to be asking with this debate. And the thought is that instead of defending a specific nature or nurture perspective, most psychological researchers now are investigated how nature and nurture interact together, as opposed to seeing them as separate and isolated. So for example, when we look at something like mental illness, psychologists understand that a genetic predisposition and an appropriate environmental trigger are required for a mental disorder to develop. So it's a both of these things. So it means that it's combining on the person's physical nature in terms of like if your parents had a certain illness, a type of cancer or a type of hereditary disease like I had with, well not disease, but hereditary problem like I had with my varicose veins, that puts me, I mean this is talking about mental illness, but a different, trying to prove my point here. The person's physical nature, you need an aspect of that, but you also need an environmental trigger, not trigger. And it's that environmental trigger which switches the gene on, rather than the DNA of genes itself. There's a really good video which can probably explain this better than I, but the idea that, say, smoking, for example, if your parents are smokers, you're more likely to become a smoker. All the stats and the statistics show that. You're not born a smoker, but because of how our genes work, they imprint certain, it's almost like your cells have imprints from your parents' lives and your grandparents' lives all in there, so that you almost have this trigger that makes you more susceptible to smoking. So you have the nature aspect of it within you, but the environmental factor of being surrounded by cigarettes in the household might be the trigger which flicks that switch on, which is the nature component. So this is looking at how they interact as opposed to how they're separate. Another example that researchers looked at was called the Dutch hunger winter. So during the Second World War, they found that children who were in the womb during the famine increased or experienced a lifelong increase in their chances of developing various health problems compared to kids conceived after the famine. So again, that's that idea of that nurture environmental factor coming into play, but because of the nature of that predisposed illness, it could flick the switch. So watch both of these two videos. They'll explain it a bit more in depth, but it's a very interesting angle when we're discussing this debate of how the two things interact. And that's our lesson. Thank you very much.